Hello and welcome to a few minutes talking about the ever-present topic of relationships. My name is Mike Meyer and I'm a licensed counselor in mental health and addictions, and I also had the privilege and experience of being part of a relationship clinic with John Gottman type of experiences and influences. I studied with Mr. Gottman up in Seattle for an unforgettable weekend, and that led me to this Gottman clinic. And John Gottman is a researcher around relationships, and his wife is a therapist, so they're a pretty good team. And a lot of best practices for relationships have come out of Gottman studies. So the next few minutes, I'm going to refer to some of those best practices. Best practices do not necessarily mean they're for everybody, but this is what some of the research shows are some relationship doorways into what works for a lot of people as an aggregate. So on this big topic, I'm going to solve all of your relationship problems in about 10 minutes, and therefore we won't need all the songs and poems and stories about relationships anymore. That's another example of why best practices are just best practices and that they don't work for everybody. But I'm very excited about some of these principles, and I think you will be too, because these are some good things to remember. And I'm going to be touching on what might seem like a sporadic series of things, but I'll try to tie it together and maybe make a little bit of a story or a flow about how to go about relationships. And where I usually like to start with that is around communication. How can you have great relationships without good communication? And communication is not something that comes automatically or without some investment or understanding of best practices. And here are a few of them. First, a good thing to keep in mind is that when we communicate, we're doing it in many different ways, like I'm doing now. I use hand signals, I use eye contact, and I use words. And there's been some research that shows that words are only 7% of how people get meaning. 58% through the inflection, and another 38% through body language. So you might want to be aware of that, both in how you're imparting information and how you're receiving information in communication. Using I statements is very helpful. I work with a lot of different couples and a lot of different types of problems, and I found that one of the most effective tools is to use an I statement with feeling words and then stop. There's real power in that. And there's a direct line to the heart when we go to a simple place and a place where we own our feelings before we start getting into how to figure things out and how to understand the problems in front of us. So our feelings matter in communication, and they're a good place to access, and we feel more successful in relationships when we're most regulated in our feelings. So good thing to tune into off the bat. Taking one issue at a time is another best practice around communication, rather than sort of dumping several issues and holding on to them. Towards that, having the elephant in the middle of the room always talked about. If there's something you have been holding on to and have been unwilling to talk about it, that is all that much more of an indication that it needs to be communicated. Holding on to things is just never really successful and can build resentment. Now, Gottman has built some building blocks to relationships, and he calls these bids. And bids are micro examples of communication and connection. So I'm doing some bids right now. I'm doing the eye contact, I'm doing the hand gestures. Even leaning forward can be a bid. A hand on somebody's shoulder, a smile, all those things, and so many more are bids. And we have countless bids in communication that sometimes we don't even notice. So noticing them and how we respond to bids is a key practice to understand communication. There are different ways to respond to bids. One is leaning into them. One is stonewalling, and one is opposing. the communication. So most successful outcomes come from leaning in and active listening to the bid and acknowledging the bid. You might want to notice if you are stonewalling or ignoring the bid, and then also opposing the bid with ridicule or sarcasm. Of course, that doesn't work very well. I want to also note that when I'm talking about relationships, I'm not just talking about intimate relationships. This is also for work relationships, friendships, things like that, even though some of this will be framed as intimate relationships. And here's one, date night. So a powerful practice to connection is going out on dates together. And this has become so affecting that as a therapist, I can almost tell whether people have had a date night or not by when they come in. And having a date night at least once a week is critical to connection, to have a different context to your relationship rather than some of the mundane things you may be doing together, either in home life or in work life. So date night, go out and have fun. And people have asked me, well, do certain things constitute a date night? Like if we watch TV together? And not really. I think a date night is more about going out and exploring together and having communication together. That's the most optimal place, often in an unfamiliar territory or a beloved territory. And then there's love maps, ways to track each other's day-to-day goings-on, not through a probing or an accountability standpoint, but through curiosity, through being really curious about somebody else's experience. Love maps are definitely a best practice towards connection by just knowing each other's world. And they have to be updated. Love maps change because people's day-to-day life changes and their connections change and their emotions change. There's a core principle around building a foundation of connection, and it's called the bank account of emotions and of connection. So in relationship, we build our bank account by making more deposits than withdrawals. And our deposits can be things like bids, or like date nights, or kind words, or a number of things, ritual together, a number of things that are proactive, preventative, and anticipatory and kind and caring towards the other person unilaterally, doing it from the inside out before something comes up. So that's a good way to prevent problems, because when problems come up, you're going to want to have that bank account shored up and to be able to draw emotionally on those times that you've invested in your connection. Times of transition are very important in relationship, when you're saying hello to each other, saying goodbye, or when you're maybe going to bed at night, things like that. So paying attention to times of transition, and how you start a conversation is 96% more likely to end it positively, if it's positive, than if you start it negatively. That's how tied the end of a conversation is to the beginning. Much like writing a letter and a salutation, you're not going to start it with harsh words. You're going to start it with endearing and caring connection first. And that really goes a long way into how the connection's going to go. While I'm throwing statistics at you, another very interesting factoid is that 69% of any issues that do come up in relationship will never be resolved in your lifetime. Congratulations, you'll never figure it out. The other 31%, you will be successful. You will come to an agreement on those. So of course that indicates that it's not about the issues themselves that gets in people's way. It's often how we talk about them. That's where the opportunity for connection is the macro communication, how we come together to acknowledge the phenomena of how we're communicating and processing rather than the content. That is a very effective practice in observing your emotional well-being during the conversation, and the content really does come second. That being said, if the content does go awry, there are best practices also around repair. And I won't go too far into the repair concepts, but suffice to say that you can go back with things like apologies and taking responsibility and backtrack into a place of correction and repair. Here's another statistic. Most couples will lose their relationship from fading away rather than from arguments. So repair does come second, emotional investment comes first. And those bank account deposits. So a couple more things. Sharing each other's emotional history is a very powerful way of connecting. I don't remember the whole saying, but I believe it goes something like, people remember us for not what we thought about them, but how they made us feel. Our emotional connection is super important, and it's a vulnerable place to share our emotional history with someone else, but it has big payoffs, and we can really feel very connected that way. And also, towards the future, sharing hopes and dreams together. And Gottman has a story about a couple that retired after 50 years together, and they visited him, and the man in the relationship said, "We are so excited to finally be able to retire and go travel." And she had this shocked look on her face and said, "What do you mean? We're going to retire with my parents in Nebraska and stay with them." And they had never talked about it. So while that might seem like a preposterous situation where they had never talked about it in 50 years, it's really incredibly common. And I see it as a therapist where people have not talked about their hopes and dreams and left it up to assumptions and up to comfort levels. And sometimes we need to address our comfort levels and challenge them in order to place that vulnerability into a situation where we can hope and dream together and go to some brainstorming and some care, and not necessarily matching what each other's dreams are, but expressing what they are, because that's often a big motivator to how we connect. I want to tell another story about a type of communication that its inventor, Marshall Rosenberg, has had a lot of success with. He's had so much success that he had someone approach him and say, "You know, your talk on nonviolent communication was so impactful to me that we actually achieved world peace, because I happen to be a negotiator for the United Nations. And I took these principles in, and people from entirely different cultures got on the same page, and these best practices of your method of nonviolent communication, the 4-step program that you've imparted, was extremely effective. But Mr. Rosenberg, I just have one question for you. How do I use this on my mother?" And so it goes. Our loved ones have enormous impact on us. We can feel frozen or overly invested in how other people feel around us, and tune back in to what your needs are, how you want to connect, how your emotional history informs you. Share that with another and be open to somebody else's, even if in the same family. I won't go too far into family therapy, that's another talk, but for now I want to thank you for joining me on this talk. It's been a privilege talking to you about some of these best practices that I hope you will take to each other and to learn more about. And I want to again reference and thank John Gottman for being an information source and a researcher on some things that we're finding more and more about for best practices. Enjoy your time together. Thank you.